just arriving. Could I ask, let's do a quick sound check. Somebody could be kind enough just to send me a note to say they can hear me okay. Yep, great. Thank you. So that sounds like we're good. Okay, we've got about a minute left, so okay, it's 2 o'clock, so let's get started. Welcome everybody to this webinar today, and the subject is why conduct a functional safety assessment. So just before we get into that, I'll tell you a little bit about exida and what we do, and make sure my screen is still doing what it should be doing. Okay, so for those of you not familiar with us, we've been around for about 16 years. We've specialized in functional safety, certainly on the certification side of products, but also on the services side. We provide a range of services to help companies with their functional safety, cybersecurity, and alarm management issues. As you can see, we're a global organization. We have two main offices, one in sunny Pennsylvania and the other one over in Germany, but we also have offices around the world in the UK, Singapore, South Africa, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, etc. So as I mentioned, we have three main disciplines with the functional safety, alarm management, and cybersecurity, and we can service a range of industries. The beautiful thing about it is that these three disciplines are what we call industry agnostic. They can be applied to any industry. So we work in the automation industry, the process industries, the automotive, and the nuclear. And we help manufacturers with their development processes and procedures, their functional safety management. We certify products for them. Also now we're doing cybersecurity as well, so we're certifying products for cybersecurity, and we provide tools. The Excellencia suite is probably the most popular tool on the market for helping with the safety lifecycle activities. System designers, again, from helping them with functional safety management, doing SIL verification, and providing the tools again through the Excellencia suite. End users, helping with the safety lifecycle and providing support for all the tasks there. We do a lot of PHA facilitation, LOPA facilitation, SRS creation, etc. And for the engineering contractors as well, competence development. We have our certified functional safety expert, certified functional safety practitioner, and also our functional safety practitioner qualifications. Reference materials, we do publish a lot of material. We've written a lot of books about safety, and also if you go to our website, and I do encourage you to go there, there's a lot of free information. There's a lot of white papers and blogs, as well as these types of webinars, and these webinars are recorded, they're archived, they're little YouTube videos, so you can watch them fairly easily. And then we also have our SAEL, which is our safe automation equipment list, where you can find certified devices for more or less any particular type of equipment in the process industry. Part of the certification is not just the products, but also personnel and procedures. We do provide functional safety certification for engineering companies for the 61511 compliance, and we also do run our Certified Functional Safety Expert Professional. And I'm sure some of you listening to this webinar today probably have been on some of those courses. bit about me. I've been around in industry for nearly 40 years now and been mostly in safety and controls. Started off as basically a design engineer designing the hardware and software, and worked for an English company, Industrial Control Services, which is now part of Rockwell, designing some of the safety systems that we had in the early 80s. And since then I've moved on to automation, been in the DCS world for about 15 years, and then finally came back to safety again when I joined Exida about 4 years ago. I also teach the functional safety engineering course and do most of the courses in the UK. So some of you have probably seen me before. So, enough about the intros. Why conduct a functional safety assessment? Good question. Well, COMA as well as OSHA in the US require operators of hazardous processes to follow best practice. So what's best practice? Well, there's the term RAGA-gap, which most of you are probably familiar with. This is the recognized and generally accepted good engineering practice. And the IEC 61511 or the S84 is recognized as being RAGA-gap and is built on the principles of good engineering practice. It's also built around the safety life cycle. And the interesting thing about the safety life cycle is that it's not a prescriptive standard. So the 1511 doesn't tell you this is what you've got to do and this is how you do it. It just says this is what you've got to do. How you do it's up to you, basically. So what it gives is some flexibility, and it allows for advancements in technology and procedures and practices. As you'd expect, it's a performance-based standard, so therefore we would be looking to monitor and improve performance. And the whole point is to ensure that problems of the past are not repeated. Some of the old prescriptive designs can be very rigid. For example, in the old days, the class 5 meant that you had to have basically 3 sensors voted 2 out of 3. You had to have an AK6 PLC, which is basically an old TMR or some form of specialized safety controller in its day, but then it had a single solenoid and single actuator, so it really didn't give you much. It gave you an expensive front end, but gave you a very weak and potentially dangerous back end. The other thing with the safety life cycle, it's designed to provide a consistent approach. So the whole point is that when you're dealing with trying to mitigate and assess risk, you have a consistent methodology for doing that. And what we're trying to get to, of course, is we're trying to get to a balanced designs where we can balance the risks and the reduction in risk against the performance of the system and the overall cost and maintenance of the design. And we're also looking, since it's a performance-based standard, we're looking at a method to consistently measure performance. So that was the intention of the safety life cycle. If we look at some interesting statistics, the HSE did a study back in '95, and then they repeated it again in 2003, but what they looked at is what were the causes, accidents causes involving control systems, and what they saw was 44% was due to specification issues, whether it's poorly specified, whether it was not specified at all, and also design and implementation. So these tend to be more on the systematic side of things in terms of the approach. Were the people who were doing the design, for example, were they competent? Were they trained? Were they following procedures? Were they doing proper design reviews? Were they documenting that? Did they capture all the requirements properly? How did they know they captured all the requirements properly? And so on and so forth. And that sort of leads us into part of the objectives of the life cycle. Obviously, building safer designs that we don't experience the problems of the past, cost-effective designs that match your design with risk, and eliminate the weak link designs that really cost a lot and give you very little. And the whole point is we're trying to eliminate systematic faults, faults introduced by either a lack of training, a lack of knowledge, a lack of competency, poor processes and procedures, or not following the processes and procedures that are in place, and so introducing these potential problems. And then the other thing is to reduce the potential for random faults. This is where we get hardware problems or problems with the equipment that could cause spurious or false trips of our system. So that's the basic objective. So where does this lead us to? Well, if you look at successes with the safety life cycle, there was a study done by Shell, and you can see that they found that 49% of their safety functions were over-engineered. Now that's in itself not necessarily a bad thing, but it does mean that it's probably costing you more to maintain those functions. 4% were under-designed or under-engineered, which were unsafe. So of course that's still something that needs to be eliminated, and 47% had no change. So there was still room to improve again, and that's where, if you have a performance-based life cycle, if you're doing the right things, if you're measuring your performance, you can actually help improve and reduce your cost over time. So if we look at the safety life cycle, it's effectively three main phases. There's what we call the analysis phase, where we're looking at the process hazards, we're doing our risk assessments, we're looking at the allocation of safety functions to protection layers. We go through and we do our layer of protection analysis. We look at what's our unmitigated event frequencies, and therefore how much further do we need to go to achieve our target frequencies. That determines what our SIL targets will be for SIFs in our SIS. And at the end of all of that analysis phase, we should have what we call a safety requirement specification, a process safety requirement specification, it's sometimes known, conceptual design, that you can use to then go into the design and engineering. And during the design and engineering phase, this is where we do detailed design, which would be the hardware and the software. We go through our SIL verification, we'd look and make sure that we met target integrity for our SIFs. We go through, do our FAT, and then if that's all well and good, we go and then do our installation and commissioning and our final validation before startup. And then we're into our operation cycle, where we're into proof testing and management of change. But of course, part of all of this is where we have to do our functional safety assessment. Now, 1511 defines it as an independent, diverse cross-check of safety lifecycle work. And what we're trying to do here is to identify and correct systematic faults or potential systematic failures early on, or as early on as possible, because obviously the further down through the life cycle we go, the more expensive and more delays it puts into solving these problems. And what we're looking at to see is, does the safety instrumented system meet the SRS and actually achieve the functional safety? Those of you that may have sat in on my SRS webinar I did a few weeks back, I was explaining that the purpose of the SRS is to capture all the requirements for the SIS. And for each SIF, there has to be a functional requirement and an integrity requirement. And so therefore it has to be well specified. You know, what's your proof test interval? What's your mission time? If you have diagnostics, what's coverage are you looking to achieve? What's your mean time to fail spurious, your spurious trip rate? What's your mean time to restore? What's your safe state? Are we de-energizing? Are we energizing to trip? And so on and so forth. And all of that has to be documented along with the target SIL. So that's part of what we're doing here, is we're making sure that we meet all the requirements of the SRS. And here again, when you conduct a functional safety assessment, it can be an independent team, or at the very least it needs to be one competent, and the emphasis here is on competent senior person who's not involved in the design. So typically a lot of companies will involve third parties like us to come in and do an independent functional safety assessment. Some companies, the larger companies, might have an independent group that they use to do that too. But at the very least they need to be competent. The standard's very clear about the competency requirement, and in fact in the new 1511 standard that's just been released, I've been told, that's quite a strong theme, the competency aspect of it. Now, in the old 2003 standard, it said that you have to perform, or it's recommended that there are 5 functional safety assessments performed. But the only one that really needed to be done that was mandatory was the one at least at stage 3, and this is basically once you've gone through commissioning and validation before you start up, and this is commonly known as the pre-startup safety check. Well, in the new standard now, I've been told again that instead of all 5, it's 4 of the 5 have been made mandatory. So here again, you're supposed to do one at stage 1. And this is once you've done the risk assessment and you've done the process SRS, the initial SRS, that's when you should be doing your first FSA. And then the second one should be done after you've done the detailed SIS design, usually during FAT or after FAT. If you leave it until stage 3, then you could be in for a shock and for some problems if you find that you haven't met everything that you need to meet. And then stage 4 is after experience in operation and maintenance. Here again, we come back to the fact this is a performance-based standard. The standard says that you should periodically, and again it doesn't define what periodically means, but it says you should periodically go back and assess the performance of your system. That means you should be, if you're doing your proof test procedures properly, if you're recording your data properly, if you're recording the as found, as left conditions, you should be able to accumulate operational data. And typically most companies will redo PHAs every 5 years. So 5 years is a reasonable amount of time to collect data. And if you're doing it properly, you should be able to use that data to assess the performance, because you're supposed to use your field data to go back and reassess and see if the integrity of your SIFs have been maintained, and you may even find that if they've been improved and you're actually achieving a higher level of safety, in which case that you assess the need to maybe back off a bit on some of the testing. The proof test intervals might be able to be reduced a bit. So, but that also has to be assessed by a competent person. So if we come back to the safety life cycle, here's where we should be doing FSA 1. We should be doing our first FSA after we've gone through and done our PHAs, looked at the layers of protection, done our LOPA, and then gone through and done a conceptual design and ended up with our process SRS. Now, what we've found is when we sometimes get involved later on to do SIL verification, we find that typically there are problems with the PHA or with the LOPA. And again, if you did your FSA 1 and it was done by a competent body or competent person, they should be able to find any gaps or any holes and help solve those before moving on to the next stage. That's the whole point of doing the FSAs. So for example, with the HAZOP and the process hazard analysis, have all the hazards been properly identified? And this is where, again, if you've got a plant that's been in operation for 30 or 40 years, you should have pretty good event history. And this is where we start looking at leading and lagging indicators. Lagging indicators should give you a sense of how well you've handled process safety in the past. And obviously if you've had process safety incidents, and I'm not talking here about slips, falls and spills, that sort of thing. I'm talking about if you've had releases, if you've had fires, that sort of thing from the process side. So it's very important to make sure you have good event history and you can refer to that history to see, okay, what have we had before? Did we actually identify these hazards that have occurred before? And if not, then we need to obviously take them into consideration now. Then, of course, standards come into play. In the UK, there's particular standards that will be there. COMA obviously is going to be going to have specific requirements. And consequence analysis. You've done your hazards. You identify what the potential hazards. Now you're going to see how bad is it going to be if it occurs. What's the consequence? And here again, the lagging indicators will be useful if you've seen or if you've had incidences that have resulted in consequences. How bad were they? And then you identify what layers of protection you have in place. And at this stage, we're looking at non-SIS type layers of protection, non-SIFs. So BPCS, the Basic Process Control System, is a potential layer of protection. There can be other things that you have in there that you'll be looking at. And then when you go through and do likelihood analysis, the LOPA, this is where you start looking at what residual risk have you got left after you've considered your layers of protection. And here again, that residual risk compared to your tolerable risk will give you a ratio that tells you, okay, I need to go to a SIL 1 or a SIL 2. So LOPA should help you identify your target SILs for your SIFs. And as you can see, it's an iterative process. Each SIF will be designed specifically to handle a particular hazard. So at the end of that, you come out with a set or a number of SIFs with particular target SILs, and then you would develop your initial safety specification, your process SRS as we call it. And here again, what we look at is, have we captured all the requirements in the SRS? Have we identified properly? And this is where we do our stage 1 FSA. So is all the documentation complete? Have we captured everything? Have we picked up all the potential hazards? Have we done our layer of protection analysis properly? Have we reviewed the target SILs? Have we got those well defined? So that's the completeness of that particular FSA. Have we captured all the requirements? So once we've done that, we then move into our design and build. And here, this is where we get into the detailed design side of things, where we're defining what particular equipment we need to do. And once we've done that, we would go through and do our test. And at this point, this is where we do our FSA 2. So now we capture the requirements, we check them to make sure they were correct in FSA 1. We've gone through and done the design and implemented it, and we're going through our FAT to make sure it meets the requirements. And now, so FSA 2 is saying, okay, have we implemented correctly what was defined in the SRS? So, does the SIF design meet the target SIL? And is there an equipment justification report? Part of the requirement is when you've got your conceptual, or when you've got your initial SRS and you're doing your conceptual design, is to look at what technology you want to use. In some cases, if it's a greenfield site, the easiest thing to do is to use certified devices. Why? Well, certified devices gives you the confidence that as far as possible, the manufacturer's met best practice. He's done everything he can to eliminate systematic issues. So if it's a SIL 2 capable or a SIL 2 certified, with a systematic capability of SIL 3. That's a no-brainer if you've got a SIL 2 requirement. Those of you that have been on my course know the phrase of RTFM, read the flaming manual. It's very important to make sure that when you're selecting equipment, even if you're selecting certified equipment, you read the safety manual. Because if it says it's SIL, if you have a SIL 2 requirement, say, and it says it's SIL 2 capable, the safety manual will tell you what that means. So for example, if it says it's SIL 2 capable, the safety manual may say, well, you need at least 2 of them and they have to be configured this way with these switches and this particular software. Because if you don't and you end up designing it with one device, you're not going to meet the SIL 2 requirement. So it's very important to make sure that you, if you're using certified devices, that you read the manufacturer's safety manual. If you're not using certified devices, then you have to go proven in use. And proven in use is a pretty tough requirement because in the 2010 61508 standard, it defines what they call Route 2H. And Route 2H says that you need at least 90% accuracy in your failure data. So this is not statistical, this is actual. You've got to have 90% accuracy. So it's a very tough one to meet. and if the plant hasn't been keeping very good records and doesn't have accurate failure data, then you have to rely heavily on the manufacturer. And here again, the manufacturer is not necessarily going to meet that either, because it all depends on how failures are classified. If the manufacturer receives something back from the field where they said it fails and they put it through their normal testing and they find no problem, how do they classify that? Is that a failure or is it not a failure? So proven in use is a valid methodology, but it is time consuming and it is complicated. So once you've gone through and selected your technology, then you can look at the architecture. And at this stage you can probably start off with using the tables that are in 1511 or 1508. And then you'd start looking at determining the test plan, and this is where you start thinking about proof test intervals. And here again, if you're using certified equipment, you can always go to the safety manual to see what the manufacturer recommends to achieve a certain level of coverage. Then you would start looking at the reliability and safety calculations. This is where we start getting into the SIL verification. Once you've done that, you will end up with your detailed hardware and software safety requirements and the design documentation. So once you've got the detailed design, you've designed it, you've put it all together, you've written the software, now you need to test it. And at this stage, once you've gone through and done your factory acceptance test, then you do your stage 2 FSA to make sure that all of this is still meeting the requirements. So once we've gone through that, we go into the site, the installation and commissioning, and now you're doing your validation, your final pre-startup safety check, your FSA 3, which in the 2003 is mandatory. But of course in the new 2016, the first 3 and the next one are also mandatory. So FSA 3 at the moment, very important. So what are the key items here? Well, you've got to have your operating, testing and maintenance procedures in place. This also means that if there's any training requirements for the operations people and the maintenance people, that needs to be done too. The other thing you're supposed to do is a cybersecurity audit. Now, in the new 2016 edition, it puts a lot of emphasis on cybersecurity, and so end users will have to show that they've taken sufficient steps to improve or actually to safeguard the SIS from potential cyber incursions. So there's a heavy emphasis on that, and my recommendation is always to do that initial cyber review during FAT, because when it's on the shop floor, it's easier to do that. And if you want to do penetration testing or anything like that, which could potentially upset the system, you want to do that on the shop floor and not when it's in the field. You also should do it again before you start up, because during commissioning, as we all know, things change. People will be in their laptops with trying to reconfigure ports and things like that. So there's always the potential to introduce cyber issues. So it's very important to make sure you do another check before you start up. So with the validation here, we're looking at the equipment meets the SRS. We've done all the commissioning, it's complete, reports are done, we've done our cybersecurity audit, we've done our vulnerability assessment, and this is where we, right now, in the 2003, that's where you have to do. Now, 2016, it's going to be much stricter with the others. So what happens if we only performed FSA 3 and we failed? Well, that could be potentially disastrous because, of course, if you don't pass the FSA 3, you can't start up. If you can't start up, there might be some contractual issues, there'll be delays, and depending upon how badly it fails, you may have to go back, all the way back to the first part of the life cycle. So all of that would be very costly. And the question really is, can you afford that? And of course the answer is no. Most people will say no, we can't. So it behooves us to do those first 2 FSAs prior to doing FSA 3. Because if we've done them right, we shouldn't have any real problems when we get to FSA 3. So once we've gone through and we've done our pre-startup safety check, we're now in the situation where we can get into our operation phase. And I can see there's quite a few questions flying in here, so I will have those at the end. Let's come over here. Nope. So, FSA 4 talks about operational evidence. And here again, this is what I was saying about a performance-based standard. You need to be able to assess and measure your performance. So it's very important to do that. So what does that mean? Well, if you look here, Safety Lifecycle has a single box that says SIS operation and maintenance. It's actually clause 16. So this is where your operational maintenance plans and proof test procedures come into play. And there's an expression, those of us old enough to remember it, of the 20-20-20, which was, it was 20 weeks design, 20 months implementation, and 20 years in operation. So from the life cycle point of view, 95% of our time is going to be spent in that operation and maintenance side. And if we don't follow the procedures, if we don't do the proof testing that's specified in the SRS, then we might as well forget having done the first 2 phases, because we won't have met the integrity, we will compromise the system, and so on and so forth. And of course, as soon as we do that, we increase the probability of having a dangerous situation occur and an incident. So the proof testing has to be undertaken per the SRS in terms of the coverage and in terms of the frequency. Now, obviously, if we're finding that our results are better than expected, then we can do an assessment and decide whether or not we can back off a little bit on some of the proof testing. The same thing with the trips. We should be recording real and spurious trips. If we've defined in the SRS that our MTTFS, or our basically spurious trip rate, shouldn't be any more frequent than once every 25 years, and in the first 3 years we've had 2 trips, we should be looking at that as to see why has that occurred. What's causing that? Is it a systematic issue or is it a random issue? And then the field failures themselves have to be analyzed. The problem with a lot of systems at the moment is that a lot of the failures are classified as being systematic. When you do that, you are not going to be able to include systematic in the calculation because systematic doesn't come into the random calculation, which is where we do our probability of failure on demand. So the way to do that is to assume that all field failures are random until proven otherwise. So for example, if you get a spurious trip through some piece of equipment saying it was faulty and it causes the trip, that would be recorded as random. Now if, having been repaired and or replaced, you get the same problem occurring a little while later with the same piece of equipment, now you could say, well, there's a possibility that that could be not just random, it could be systematic, and then you can do the necessary investigation. So the whole point is that if you record the data properly, you can use it to re-verify your performance meets the requirements, the SRS. And if you're getting better performance and there is expert judgment made to say, yes, we can change, we can modify the rate of doing proof testing, or let's say if we're doing some partial valve stroke testing and we might not be able to, or we might not need to do that. So that judgment would be made. If those changes are implemented, then that needs to be reflected in the SRS, because the SRS has to be a live document. Then the final one is the management of change, and here again the important part is that changes need to be assessed by competent senior personnel for safety impact. Back to that old chestnut of competency. It's very important that this is done by either a single person or a team of people who are competent and understand what they're looking at. Because any changes will require you to go to the, or return to the appropriate safety life cycle step. And of course changes have to be authorized. So at that point, that functional safety assessment is to go through and say, all right, what's the safety impact with this particular change? Are we going to accept it? Are we not going to accept it? And then it has to be reflected back in to the appropriate phase of the life cycle. And then if we proceed to decommissioning, again, that has to be treated with care, especially if you're going to decommission the system in phases. Then you have to make sure that as you take SIFs offline, there has to be some method for covering that. So, how can you do good FSAs? Well, one way, and I'm a great exponent of checklists. I think checklists are a very useful way of making sure you don't miss things. So, making sure we've covered all the bases. And it also gives you repeatability. My favorite analogy is the pilots. Now, a pilot may have been flying for thousands of hours, but every time he gets into the cockpit, he doesn't rely on his memory. He takes out his pre-flight checklist and goes through it, makes sure he covers everything. Same thing here. The purpose of a functional safety assessment is basically to investigate based upon evidence, and what you're doing is you're judging that your functional safety can be achieved by your SIS and its relevant SIFs. Use of an independent third party, that's always a good way of doing it because it's independent again, emphasis on independent. Use of a qualified, here again, competency comes into play. Independent third party to undertake the functional safety assessment, or use of a senior and competent personnel or a team of them to undertake the tasks. Tools can obviously help you, can help document the process and results, and it also enables you to get consistency and can save you time. Documentation, got to make sure all the documents are readily available to carry out the FSA, and make sure that the latest versions are being used too. Because if the documents aren't there, then it makes the FSA longer and more tedious. And of course, if it's longer, it's going to cost more. And then training. It's very important to ensure that the personnel are trained and understand the requirements. This is very true. The standard's clear that the maintenance people need to understand what the SIFs in the SIS are protecting against. And so they need to be very familiar with what are the startup procedures, any resets, overrides, etc., etc. So training is part of that. And if you're going into do, for example, the FSA 3, you need to make sure that all procedures are in place for the O&M and that they're trained properly. Like I said, checklists can help. Excellentia actually does have these checklists built in, so you can refer to the specific clauses of the standard, and of course you can do that with the corresponding project information as well. So it all supports your functional safety management and your FSA program. Now the 2003 recommends the 5 FSAs with at least one, which is FSA 3, to be carried out, but the new one, the 2016, will mandate that all of them have to be carried out. Well, in fact, I've told that's changed again. It's only 4 out of the 5 that have to be done. But even so, the recommendation is that you do all 5, because the whole point is that you're continually looking to make sure you meet the requirements, plus you're also trying to safeguard against potential systematic problems. And don't wait until FSA 3 to conduct your first FSA, because if you have problems, it's going to get very costly. And if you can't start up because of that, then there might be contractual issues too. And if you do undertake 5, it'll help avoid this costly rework later on. Obviously, use of tools and checklists can help ensure consistency, and competent and well-trained people need to be involved. So this is where you will probably want somebody who's a CFSE, and this, or it might be your PSM, your plant safety manager, that's involved in all of this, or you might use independent qualified third parties to do this. Whichever way you go, the emphasis has to be on competent, that they know what they're doing. Okay, well, that's it. Let me see, I do see quite a few questions. Let's go back here and see what we have. Okay, let's see. What would an FSA 1 look like considered for a new facility compared to an existing facility? Well, again, the FSA 1 is to make sure that the PHA has been done properly and that the hazards have been identified. If recommendations have been made in the HAZOPs, they need to have been at least addressed. Somebody needs to have looked at them. If the LOPAs haven't been done properly, you might find that you're missing scenarios. So that's part of what you would do with the FSA 1. Now, for an existing facility, same thing. If you're going back to redo the PHAs, you should be taking the same approach. Have they looked at all the hazards? Have they followed through on any recommendations? Part of the problem with the way PHAs are done is that sometimes people jump immediately from the PHA into defining SIFs, and that's not the purpose of doing that. The purpose of doing that is to identify the hazards and the potential consequences. then there's whatever safeguards will be looked at afterwards. Now you can make recommendations for consideration, but the same is true. If you only have an FSA 3, does it have to consider FSA 1 and FSA 2 items anyway? Well, yes, of course, because it's got to meet, the whole point is that does the design meet the SRS, and therefore does the SRS, is that complete? And so you have to look at the SRS. And remember what I said, the SRS has to cover all the requirements, including if there are any non-safety requirements, they have to be considered as well. But basically, the CIFs have to have a functional requirement and an integrity requirement. So it needs to be complete. That's why I say if you wait until FSA 3, you may find that there's a lot of holes that need to be filled, and you won't be able to start up. Will all FSAs need to be independent? If you're talking about independent in terms of the team, the independence has to be independent of that particular stage of the life cycle. So in other words, if you're doing FSA 1, you shouldn't have been involved in the PHA or the LOPA. If you're doing 2, you shouldn't have been involved in the design, and of course 3, you shouldn't have been involved in the implementation. So the answer there is yes, there should be independence. Uh-oh, the audio cut out during FSA 2. You were talking about hardware fault tolerances when you're trying to achieve. Oh dear. I don't know if what I was talking about here when I was talking about hardware fault tolerances, I said that if you're, for example, if you're trying to achieve a SIL 2, what you need to do, and you're using certified devices, you should refer to the safety manual, because sometimes the manufacturers will say SIL 2 capable, and it's that word capable that has to be an alarm going off in your head that says, all right, I need to look at what that means. Because if a manufacturer is SIL 2 capable, in his safety manual he has to say, well, okay, it's SIL 2 capable, and if you're going to use it for SIL 2, you need at least 2 of them, and they have to be configured this way. Because if you design it with just 1, you won't meet the requirement. So that's what I was talking about there. Because when we get into conceptual, the conceptual SRS, and you don't have a design, how do you know what hardware fault tolerance to start with? And that's where I was talking about using the tables in 08 and 1511, where they'll define a minimum hardware fault tolerance to achieve a particular SIL. So you start with that, and then you go from there. Okay, what else we got? Does all stages of SIL assessment involve team members who are to participate in? I'm not sure I understand that particular question. SIL assessment, basically SIL assessment comes out of LOPA. If you're doing it properly, and I know that there are factions that say that you don't necessarily need to do LOPA, but effectively what you're doing is you start off with potential initiating event frequencies. You look at the layers of protection you have that are non-SIS, and if you've got 3 layers of protection, let's say, you would expect at least an order of magnitude risk reduction from each layer of protection. So if you've got 3 layers of protection, you're looking at 1,000 risk reduction factor. So if your target is 10 to the minus 5, say, then you've still got to reduce by another 100, and that would say that you'd need a SIL 2. So that's how you do the SIL assessment. And then the people that are involved in doing SIL assessment is usually a team that's again similar to the one that was used for the PHA, but you might have some operations people involved in it, and it's facilitated, and it should be facilitated by an independent, again, competent person. Many times we come to do SIL verification and we find that there are problems in the LOPers. They've double dipped, they've taken credit for an operator and BPCS layer twice when they shouldn't, and there's all sorts of other things that we've seen too. What's the next one? A new node added to an existing SIF to cover a new piece of equipment, FSA 5 or start at FSA 1. Depending upon, when you say a new node added to an existing SIS, if you're adding a new SIF to safeguard against a particular hazard, then yes, you would probably have to go back and look at it from an FSA 1 point of view. Okay. In reference to competent personnel, might it be worth mentioning the creation of an RACI chart at stage 1 and maintaining this throughout the process? Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that we encourage is to create some form of matrix, competency matrix, where you can identify the particular phases of the life cycle. You can list your personnel, and then you can show who has some knowledge, who's an SME, subject matter expert, who needs further training, who's got no knowledge at all. So you can use that to help. And as you go through, you would start looking at who was competent and who could be appointed to work on particular phases of the life cycle. Now, part of the problem is that quite a few companies don't have the luxury, or they don't have that depth, and that's where use of third-party, independent third parties can be helpful. What's this other one? Still questions coming in. Differences, functional safety assessment and SIS audit. Well, the audit, the functional safety audit, if you look at the definition in the standard, basically what the audit's to do is to determine whether the procedures specific to the requirements comply with those planned activities, and that they're implemented effectively and suitable to achieve the objectives. So basically, it's like a quality audit. The functional safety assessment is an investigation based upon evidence. So here again, what you're looking for is show me the evidence. So if you've done the HAZOP, you need to show the evidence of the HAZOP. If you've done the LOPA, same thing. If you've done the FAT, if you've done the design, so you need to see the evidence. And what you're looking at there is you're looking at it for one or more protection layers. So again, for the SIFs, you'd be looking at each one in turn. We have a disagreement in our FSA team between process safety lead and the independent functional safety expert. The process safety lead thinks it is acceptable to split the BPCS initiating event at 0.1 per year into 2 separate events at 0.05 per year with different protection layers. Well, without knowing, just looking at what you've said here, this is worthy of a lengthier conversation. Whoever put this question in, if you could send me an email, because I think there's several issues here that need to be addressed. I mean, just splitting it, there's a whole host of other things we'd have to look at. But Okay, what other? Qualifying people for SIS testing and SAT, FAT. Well, yes, you see again, you have to determine the competency of the people. Now you can qualify them in several ways, part of which is to go on courses and have tests, so you can do it that way. If they're involved in SAT, FAT, are they familiar with the equipment? And sometimes it's worth, if it's a new system and they're not familiar with the control system and with the SIS system, then it would be worth having some input, some training from the vendor, so that they know, how the interlocks work. They know the startups, etc., etc. Well, those are all very good questions, and the person that asked me about the BPS, please do email me, because I think that is an interesting question you raised there, and it will take a fairly lengthy amount of time to explain. If there are no more questions, I thank you all for attending. If you do think of any questions afterwards, I have put my email address there, so feel free to drop me a line and I'll be very happy to answer any questions. But just remember, functional safety assessments are there for a reason. They're there to make sure that safety checkpoints, if you like, to make sure that we've covered all our bases before we move on to the next phase, because the further down the life cycle you get, the more expensive it becomes to fix problems, and that's quite common, unfortunately. We find that a lot when we get involved in doing FSAs. So here again, if you're not sure, always ask. You can always ask, or you can research if you want to do it yourself. If not, you can always come to people like us. We'd be very happy to help, and this is what we do. So with that, I thank you all for attending, and I wish you a very good day. Bye for now.